The village of St. Clair lay draped in its usual serenity, the kind of quiet that made outsiders mistake it for harmless. Cobbled streets wound between centuries-old stone cottages, gardens spilling over with roses, and the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from chimneys. But beneath this pastoral calm, something had shattered the illusion of peace. In the centre of the village, the manor of Monsieur René Laval, a widower known for his reclusive nature and meticulous habits, had become the scene of an inexplicable horror. It was his housekeeper, Madame Berthier, who discovered the scene on a grey December morning. Monsieur Laval's study, a room he had scarcely left unattended, presented a tableau that was at once ordinary and monstrous. The window was locked from the inside, the heavy velvet drapes drawn, and the brass lock clicked firmly as if mocking any notion of forced entry. Monsieur Laval himself lay sprawled across the oriental rug, a pool of crimson spreading beneath his head. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds, nothing to suggest that a confrontation had taken place. The only oddity was a small, intricately folded origami swan perched neatly atop his desk, its delicate paper wings catching the pale light. The village constable, a well-meaning but timid man named Gendarme Leclerc, examined the scene with visible bewilderment. "It is most unusual," he muttered, peering over his spectacles. "No footprints in the snow outside, no signs of forced entry, and yet Monsieur Laval is dead. And what is this? A paper swan?" The villagers had gathered outside the manor, whispers spreading like wildfire. Some speculated on a jealous heir, others on a distant rival, and a few, the more superstitious, whispered of a curse. But nothing in the room offered any clear direction. The swan itself seemed almost to mock the investigators, beautiful, precise, and utterly meaningless. Leclerc, for all his diligence, could only shake his head. He was certain only of two things. Someone had killed Monsieur Laval, and the solution was beyond the ordinary measures of law enforcement. Word of the crime travelled quickly, and by the afternoon Hercule Poirot arrived. The little Belgian, impeccably dressed despite the chill, carried with him a calm that contrasted sharply with the frenzied atmosphere. His keen eyes took in every detail, the precise alignment of the swan on the desk, the angle of the body, even the subtle smudges of dust along the edge of the rug. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured, his voice low but firm. "There is method in this, very particular method. The ordinary mind would see only a locked room, an unfortunate death, and perhaps a suicide. But there is something else here, something hidden." Poirot began his examination systematically. He noted the lack of a weapon in the room, the undisturbed state of Monsieur Laval's papers, and the unopened bottle of brandy on the side table. Even the fireplace, often a source of hidden compartments or destruction of evidence, held nothing unusual. Yet the swan, delicate and precise, was placed with such care that it seemed less a clue than a message. Outside, the villagers speculated, their theories ranging from the fantastical to the mundane, while Poirot moved with quiet assurance. He listened to Madame Berthier recount her routine, questioned the gardener about any unusual visitors, and considered the household staff, all of whom were in place that morning and had no apparent motive. Each question seemed to close a door, yet the solution remained frustratingly out of reach. The crime was a paradox, impossibly simple in its execution, yet maddeningly complex in its presentation. Poirot recognized the hallmarks of a carefully constructed puzzle, an innocent, harmless object placed deliberately to mislead, a death designed to confound even the most diligent investigator. It was a challenge tailored for someone like him, a crime that demanded patience, observation, and above all, an understanding of the human mind behind it. As evening descended upon St. Clair, Poirot remained in the study, the room now eerily silent save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. He studied the swan once more, turning it gently in his hands, and allowed a small smile to cross his face. "Ah, yes. I begin to see," he murmured. "The key is not where the eyes would naturally look. It is in the mind of the person who created this, in the perfection of the deception itself." Outside, the village remained unaware that the enigma before them was anything but random. Behind the locked door, in a quiet manner filled with shadows and secrets, a brutal truth waited patiently to reveal itself. And Hercule Poirot, with his little grey cells working tirelessly, would uncover it, layer by intricate layer. As twilight deepened over St. Clair, Poirot moved deliberately through the manor, his eyes scanning each corner with the precision of a watchmaker. The constable had grown uneasy, hovering near the doorway, uncertain whether to interrupt or simply observe the little Belgian's methodical examination. Poirot, however, seemed entirely absorbed, his attention captured not by the obvious, the lifeless body, the locked doors, but by the subtler currents of human behavior, the slight irregularities that the ordinary eye dismissed. He knelt beside the rug, fingers hovering just above the soft pile without touching it, observing the faint traces of dust. "Notice, mon ami," he said quietly to Leclerc. "The dust near the desk has been disturbed slightly, but not as one would expect from a struggle. It is as if someone moved around, deliberately avoiding certain areas. It is the footprint of a mind, not of a foot." Poirot then turned to the desk. The origami swan had been folded with extraordinary precision. Its tiny creases were crisp, almost surgical. Yet what caught Poirot's attention most was the faint smudge of ink on its underside, invisible to the casual observer. "Ah, see here," he murmured, tracing it delicately with the tip of his finger. "A signature of haste, yes, but also of intention. Whoever placed this swan wanted it to be noticed, but perhaps not for the reason we assume." The detective's gaze drifted to a small cabinet in the corner, one that the constable had opened earlier without a second thought. It was a cabinet for Monsieur Laval's documents, yet Poirot noticed the faint indentation of a key recently removed, a subtle wear on the edge of the lock. "Curious," he murmured. "Our victim, ever même meticulous, would not leave a key carelessly." And yet, his fingers moved to the small drawer, lifting it slowly. Inside, neatly stacked papers bore no signs of tampering, yet one envelope had been opened and carefully resealed, a detail almost invisible, save to the trained eye. Poirot's attention shifted to the windows. They were indeed locked, but he observed a faint streak of condensation on the glass, a subtle trace of a finger sliding down, as if someone had leaned against it, looking out, perhaps watching. The window was not the entry, but a witness to some action, he murmured. "Yes, yes. This is already beginning to speak, if one listens carefully." It was then that he turned his attention to the household staff, who had been lingering nervously in the hall. Madame Berthier wrung her hands, her face pale and strained. Poirot's eyes, however, were drawn to the gardener, a young man named Lucien, who had been unusually quiet. There was a slight tremor in Lucien's fingers, almost imperceptible, and a faint stain on the cuff of his coat, not fresh, but out of place against the otherwise clean garment. "You, monsieur," Poirot said softly, his gaze unwavering. "You were in the study earlier than you admit, perhaps not long, but enough to leave an impression." Lucien started, his eyes widening, yet his lips remained tightly pressed. Poirot made a small, satisfied nod. "Ah, the truth reveals itself in hesitation, in what is not said rather than what is spoken." Poirot then moved to the hearth, noticing a tiny scrap of paper tucked behind the logs. On it was an inscription, written in haste, the edges torn unevenly. "A message?" Leclerc asked, peering over Poirot's shoulder. The Belgian shook his head. "Not a message to us, but to someone else, perhaps the victim, or perhaps a clue deliberately left for discovery by the wrong person." He held it up, turning it under the flickering lamplight. The handwriting was familiar, though not immediately recognizable, and the symbols, a series of tiny arrows, seemed more code than decoration. By the time the last rays of sun disappeared, Poirot had noted more than the constable could in a week. A misplaced book on the shelf, an indentation in a cushion where no one should have sat, the faint scent of cigar smoke lingering in a room that should have smelled only of brandy and old wood. Each observation hinted at movement, at someone's careful choreography, yet none provided a clear answer. The puzzle had begun to whisper, teasing the detective with the promise of revelation, but its voice was subtle, requiring the greatest delicacy to interpret. Poirot finally straightened, brushing his hands together, and looked across the study. "There is deception here, but it is a delicate, deliberate deception. Too many eyes see too many things, yet they understand nothing. And it is precisely that, mon ami, which will allow the truth to emerge." He turned toward Leclerc, his eyes glinting with quiet certainty. "We must watch, we must wait, and we must observe. For the smallest detail, the faintest hesitation, will guide us to the mind behind this crime." The constable, though overwhelmed, felt a flicker of hope. He had seen the chaos of the crime scene, the impossibility of the locked room, the meaningless swan, but he had not seen the logic hidden within it. Poirot, in contrast, had already begun to map the invisible threads, teasing out a story that only he could understand, one observation at a time. And somewhere within the manor, the brutal secret waited, trembling on the brink of exposure. The following morning, Poirot began the careful process of questioning those connected to Monsieur Laval. The villagers gathered outside the manor, whispering among themselves, while inside the atmosphere was Tao. Tea with tension. Madame Berthier, though visibly shaken, was the first to speak. Her hands trembled slightly as she recounted the events of the morning, describing how she had entered the study to bring Monsieur Laval his breakfast and found him dead. Her voice was precise, yet Poirot's little grey cells caught the subtle inconsistencies. She hesitated when describing the positioning of the swan, and her gaze occasionally flicked toward the window, as if anticipating something unseen. "Madame Berthier," Poirot said gently, leaning forward, "you are a careful woman, yes? You did not touch anything in the room?" She nodded earnestly, yet her hands fidgeted with the lace of her apron. "But tell me, did you notice anything unusual? Anything at all before you saw him?" She blinked rapidly, searching for an answer, and then muttered something about hearing footsteps the previous evening, though she could not say whose. "Footsteps?" Poirot repeated softly. "Aha! Déjà un petit mystère." Already he sensed that her testimony, though honest, might be coloured by fear or imagination. The gardener, Lucien, was next. His coat still carried the faint trace of soil from the manor's gardens, yet Poirot's attention was drawn to the slight stain at his cuff, the same subtle detail from the previous evening. Lucien's account was brief, almost too brief, as if rehearsed. He claimed to have been pruning the rose bushes when he heard nothing unusual, yet Poirot noted the way his eyes darted toward the study door every few moments, the way he hesitated before answering questions about the servants' movements. "You were in the vicinity of the study last night," Poirot said quietly, watching him closely. Lucien flushed and stammered, insisting he had not been near the study after dinner. But the slight smudge on his cuff, the trembling of his fingers, told a different story, subtle but unmistak. Able to Poirot, even the village doctor, called in to confirm Monsieur Laval's death, presented minor contradictions. He spoke of the time he arrived, the condition of the body, the absence of defensive wounds. Yet when asked whether the victim had been dead long before the discovery, he hedged, citing an unusual pallor and the chill of the room. Poirot noticed the way he avoided looking at the window, where the faint condensation had indicated someone's presence. There was nothing overtly deceitful, yet the small evasions suggested hidden knowledge, an unwillingness to share every observation. Poirot listened patiently as each account unfolded, sifting through the inconsistencies, the nervous gestures, the over-eager assertions of innocence. The housekeeper insisted she had done nothing more than her duty. Lucien was keen to emphasize his distance from the crime. The doctor offered clinical certainty without explanation. Each version of events contradicted another in tiny ways. A door left slightly ajar, a clock checked at differing times, a footprint noticed only by one person. "Ah, the truth is hidden not in grand lies but in small ones," Poirot murmured to himself, his eyes scanning the faces before him. He noted patterns, the over-eager compliance of some, the unnecessary elaboration of others, the subtle avoidance of particular topics. Each behavior spoke volumes, if one knew how to listen. "They all try to persuade us, to divert attention," Poirot said under his breath. Yet the smallest hesitation, the quietest glance, reveals their true thoughts. He realized that Monsieur Laval's death had already begun to shape the villagers' narratives, and each person had a reason to distort or obscure the truth. Fear, loyalty, perhaps guilt. Poirot paused, folding his hands neatly, then addressed the group. "It is remarkable, n'est-ce pas, how quickly a single event can hinge so many stories. Each of you tells what you think is true, yet none has seen the entire picture. And it is in these small gaps, these contradictions, that the truth waits. The room was silent, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock, each tick a subtle reminder that time was a companion to both lies and revelations. By mid-afternoon, Poirot had begun mentally charting the inconsistencies, drawing invisible lines between testimony and observation. The swan, the smudge of ink, the trace of condensation on the window, the hesitant words of witnesses, all were pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit neatly into place. He understood that deception had many voices, each one masking or redirecting, and that patience would be required to untangle the strands. Somewhere among these carefully chosen words and hidden gestures, the secret lay waiting, brutal, deliberate, and ready to reveal itself to the keen eye that would not be distracted by superficial appearances. And Poirot, with his unerring attention to detail, would find it. Poirot spent the late afternoon quietly reviewing the accounts he had gathered, pacing the study with his hands clasped behind his back. The villagers' statements were a tangle of half-truths, omissions, and nervous overreactions, each reflecting a potential motive, but none offering clarity. He could feel the invisible threads connecting them, subtle tensions woven through fear, resentment, and desire. To the casual observer, St. Clair seemed idyllic. To Poirot, it was a simmering web of passions, each one capable of driving a person to extremes. Greed was an immediate thread to consider. Monsieur Laval, despite his reclusive demeanour, had amassed a small fortune, much of it rumoured to be in liquid assets hidden within the manor. The housekeeper, Madame Berthier, had been loyal for years, yet her modest wages and the hints of private debts were not lost on Poirot. Could financial strain have prompted her to take the drastic step of murder? And Lucien, the gardener, though young and seemingly devoted, had long harboured ambitions that exceeded his station. A bequest or inheritance might have been sufficient incentive for him to act if temptation had presented itself, yet greed alone could not explain the intricate staging of the crime. The origami swan, the meticulous folding of papers, the subtle smudge of ink, all suggested a mind that relished precision and deception, traits that did not align with a simple act of opportunistic theft. Poirot considered jealousy as another potential motive. Monsieur Laval had been known to mentor young men in the village, including Lucien, offering opportunities that others had envied. Had a perceived slight, or the frustration of unfulfilled ambition festered into resentment? Lucien's nervous glances and half-hidden evasions hinted at suppressed emotions, though whether they were sufficient to drive murder remained uncertain. Revenge also lingered like a shadow in the room. Monsieur Laval had not been without enemies. Old business dealings and rivalries in the nearby towns could have left grudges smouldering over years. One of the villagers, a merchant with a persistent grievance about a land dispute, had arrived in St. Clair recently, ostensibly to resolve a matter amicably. Poirot noted the merchant's subtle insistence on his innocence, delivered with an almost theatrical calm. Such composure, however, often concealed a sharper intent. Fear was another subtle but potent element. Each witness had acted carefully, almost defensively during questioning. Madame Berthier had insisted repeatedly on her adherence to duty. Lucien had been quick to point out his own distance from the study. Even the doctor had hedged his words, careful not to reveal too much. The present CE of fear indicated not only knowledge of events, but also the possibility of complicity, or at least awareness of wrongdoing. Fear could have driven one or more to fabricate alibis or conceal minor truths, shaping the narrative to protect themselves or another. Poirot's attention returned to the small details of the house, each a potential piece in the motive maze: the slightly shifted books on the shelves, the faint trace of cigar smoke in the study, the misplaced drawer key, all were indicators of human presence and intent. He began cross-referencing these with the statements he had recorded. Lucien had denied being near the study, yet the cuff stain and the faint soil traces suggested otherwise. Madame Berthier's hesitation about the footsteps she claimed to have heard hinted at selective memory, or deliberate omission. Even the doctor's careful timing of his visit contained minor inconsistencies, enough to warrant further questioning. As the evening shadows lengthened, Poirot visualized the web of relationships, connections, and hidden desires. Each suspect had an intersecting line: greed tangled with jealousy, ambition shadowed by fear, resentment entwined with opportunity. Yet no single line provided the whole answer. The crime remained a puzzle constructed of interlocking human motives, each deliberately obscured by carefully chosen words and small controlled actions. Poirot paused, his gaze sweeping the study one final time. He understood that the key to unraveling this maze was not in focusing on a single motive, but in observing the interplay between them, the subtle contradictions, the half-confessions, the gestures that betrayed what words concealed. In this intricate lattice of ambition, envy, and apprehension, the truth would reveal itself not as a sudden explosion, but as the steady, patient alignment of hidden forces, and when it did, the brutal secret of St. Clair would be laid bare, its architect unmasked by nothing more than the keen observation of a mind trained to see what others could not. The following morning brought a flurry of activity to St. Clair. Gendarme Leclerc, buoyed by the appearance of what he considered a decisive clue, hurried from the manor to summon a local magistrate. The object in question was a small blood-stained letter, discovered tucked beneath a floorboard in Monsieur Laval's study, a note written in a shaky hand, implicating Lucien, the gardener, in what appeared to be a plot of financial theft. The letter was crude, almost childlike, but its accusation was unmistakable, and the evidence seemed incontrovertible. Within hours, the villagers whispered of a breakthrough, the excitement tangible in the cold morning air. Lucien, confronted with the letter, protested his innocence with a fervor that only heightened the sensation of guilt in the eyes of the authorities. He stumbled over his words, his previous hesitations now magnified by the presence of the magistrate and a growing crowd of onlookers. "It is not mine. I swear it," he insisted, his voice quivering, but the letter's clear accusation appeared to leave little room for doubt. Gendarme Leclerc nodded vigorously, certain that the case had finally been solved. "Ah, mon Dieu! The matter is settled," he exclaimed, glancing at Poirot as if seeking confirmation. The villagers, emboldened by the apparent resolution, began to murmur among themselves, casting furtive glances at Lucien, as if to confirm the verdict through sheer collective judgment. Poirot, however, remained silent, his small frame still and upright, observing every motion with unbroken attention. He allowed the authorities their moment of triumph, listening to the assurances and statements that Lucien was the guilty party, and yet a flicker of unease passed over his mind. The was something about the letter, its neat concealment, the almost theatrical positioning beneath the floorboard. That struck Poirot as too convenient, too obvious. Too neat," he murmured quietly to himself, turning the letter over in his hands. "A guilty party does not always leave such an elaborate gift for discovery." He questioned Lucien further, not with accusation, but with calm observation. The young man's defensiveness, the way his eyes darted toward familiar objects in the room, the subtle tension in his shoulders, all suggested fear, but not guilt. Fear of the letter, fear of false accusation, fear of consequences he had not caused. "Observe, mon ami," Poirot whispered to Leclerc, "how the guilty often seek to hide in chaos. Here, chaos has been manufactured for them." Poirot's gaze returned to the study. The swan still rested in its place, untouched. The faint smudge of ink, the condensation on the window, the slightly displaced papers, all remained, silent witnesses that contradicted the simplicity of the authorities' conclusion. Even the letter itself bore no fingerprints, besides the obvious scrawls that might have been intentionally planted. Poirot's instincts, honed over years of discerning human behavior, told him that this so-called breakthrough was a deception, carefully constructed to redirect attention. By midday, the magistrate had taken Lucien into custody, and a sense of closure spread through St. Clair. Yet Poirot remained in the study, pacing slowly, his eyes never ceasing their meticulous scrutiny. He revisited the positions of each item, the faint dust trails, the arrangement of the papers, and the subtle signs of movement within the room. Every detail whispered of planning, of someone orchestrating events not for mere opportunism, but for psychological effect. The letter was a misdirection, a calculated instrument to create a false scene. Say of resolution. Poirot's thoughts turned to the human element, the one who had manipulated perception, who had understood the instincts of the authorities, who had predicted their eagerness for a simple solution. The true culprit, he realized, was still in the shadows, patient, deliberate, and confident that their deception had succeeded. The real danger, he understood, was that this person might strike again, emboldened by the authorities' premature declaration of victory. As the afternoon light waned, Poirot stood in the center of the study, surveying the scene with unwavering attention. The village celebrated the apparent capture, but he saw beyond the illusions, the faint impressions on the rug, the subtle signs of human presence, the carefully orchestrated details designed to mislead. Somewhere, the architect of this brutal secret smiled quietly, watching the chaos of false certainty. And Poirot, undistracted by the veneer of triumph, knew that the real solution lay not in what was obvious, but in the truth that waited patiently beneath the surface, ready to reveal itself to the one who had eyes to see. As evening settled over St. Clair, Poirot lingered in the quiet of the manor, the fading light casting long shadows across the study. While the village celebrated Lucien's supposed culpability, the detective's mind was elsewhere, tracing invisible threads that linked the present crime to something far older, something carefully hidden beneath the surface of routine village life. He returned to the small details he had observed since his arrival, the dust, the condensation, the meticulously placed swan, and considered how they might relate not only to the events of the past week, but to histories long buried in the minds of the villagers. His thoughts were interrupted by Madame Berthier, who hesitated on the threshold. "Monsieur Poirot," she murmured, "there is something I did not think important before." Poirot's eyes brightened, and he gestured for her to speak. She retrieved an old, leather-bound ledger from a drawer, its cover worn, the pages yellowed with age. "Monsieur Laval kept this," she said softly. "It is accounts, letters, some notes about people who lived here long ago. I never thought them relevant to anything serious." Poirot accepted the book and leafed through its pages with the utmost care. Names, dates, and transactions filled the margins, along with cryptic annotations in Monsieur Laval's precise handwriting. Then, tucked between two pages, he discovered a folded note, brittle with age. It bore the name of Lucien's father, alongside that of the housekeeper's family, and referred to a financial dispute, something that had once threatened to divide the village into factions. The note suggested that the families had been connected by more than circumstance. They were tied by obligations, debts, and resentments stretching back decades. A pattern began to emerge, a shared history that had lain dormant, yet shaped attitudes, alliances, and grievances. Poirot studied the ledger carefully, noting subtle entries that revealed old slights, unresolved arguments, and hidden debts. He realized that Lucien's nervous behavior, the housekeeper's hesitation, even the village merchant's cautious words, could not be understood solely in the context of the present. Each had been molded by the past, influenced by interactions and conflicts that had left enduring impressions. The crime, he saw clearly now, was layered. It had roots both in contemporary circumstances and in the tangled legacies of old disputes. He recalled the merchant who had recently visited the village, the one with the calm, almost theatrical composure. A footnote in the ledger mentioned a disputed land sale that had involved Ed, his family, long ago, and Monsieur Laval had acted as arbiter. There was mention of financial loss, perceived injustice, and threats, carefully recorded but forgotten with time. Poirot's little grey cells connected the dots. Old grievances had festered in silence, shaping the motives and reactions of those now caught in the web. Poirot's attention returned to Lucien. The young man's father had been involved in the original dispute, and though decades had passed, resentment had lingered through stories, whispered warnings, and inherited distrust. Lucien's anxious movements, the faint soil traces on his coat, and his instinctive defensiveness were now reinterpreted not as signs of guilt, but as echoes of a past that had prepared him to react with caution, almost instinctively, in the presence of accusation. The housekeeper's family connections, too, were illuminated. Her loyalty to Monsieur Laval now appeared intertwined with old obligations, a desire to protect not only the man she served, but also the delicate social balance that had long governed St. Clair. The origami swan, once a puzzle in itself, might have symbolized something more subtle, a nod to patterns of old courtesy, of communication understood only by those who knew the manner and its histories intimately. Poirot paused, setting the ledger aside, his gaze sweeping the study once more. The crime was not merely a matter of immediate opportunity, nor could it be explained by a single motive such as greed or jealousy. It was the culmination of a chain of events, a convergence of present circumstances and past grievances, a careful orchestration that relied on hidden knowledge of human nature and inherited tensions. He understood now that the real criminal had leveraged this history, weaving it into the deception of the present. The premature accusation of Lucien was almost too clever. It had relied on assumptions, ions about behavior and motive, that ignored the deep currents flowing from the past. In the shadows of St. Clair's seemingly tranquil life, secrets had lain dormant for decades, and it was only by tracing these connections, subtle yet indelible, that the true story could emerge. Poirot's mind, sharp and unrelenting, felt the puzzle beginning to yield its shape, each revelation illuminating the dark recesses of both the village's history and the carefully concealed machinations of the one who had committed the crime. Poirot returned to the manor the next morning with a plan that was, by his own admission, unconventional. He did not intend to re-examine the scene or demand confessions through traditional questioning. Instead, he had decided to test the character and reactions of those involved, using the subtle power of suggestion and observation to draw out truths hidden even from the suspects themselves. He gathered Madame Berthier, Lucien, and the village doctor into the study under the pretense of clarifying minor details, but in reality he orchestrated a quiet experiment. "Mon amis," he began, speaking softly yet firmly, "it is extraordinary how people reveal themselves when they believe they are unobserved, or when they think the truth has already been discovered. I have a small exercise to demonstrate something remarkable." He placed the origami swan on the desk, its wings catching the morning light, and then took a fresh sheet of paper from a drawer. "Imagine, if you will, that this swan were a messenger. Suppose it could convey a message not by what it shows, but by what it hides. Now, each of you must describe what you see, in as much detail as possible, including anything that might be unusual, trivial, or peculiar." At first, the responses were predictable. Madame Berthier noted the folds and the crispness of the paper. Lucien mentioned the careful positio. "Ding!" The doctor commented on the elegance and symmetry. Poirot listened patiently, nodding, but he noted with sharp interest the subtle hesitations, the way Lucien's eyes flicked toward the door, the slight stiffening of Madame Berthier's hands, and the doctor's repeated glances toward the floor as if avoiding some detail he feared revealing. Then Poirot took a different tack. "Let us imagine for a moment that this swan has witnessed events," he said, his tone conversational, almost playful. "It has seen everything, yet can only speak if someone acknowledges the truth it has seen. Perhaps it saw Monsieur Laval's last moments. Perhaps it saw a visitor. Perhaps it saw a hand that should not have been there. Let us pretend it can whisper, but only to those who are honest. What do you think it would say?" A pause fell over the room. Madame Berthier's fingers twitched nervously. The doctor smiled faintly, amused but cautious. Lucien, however, reacted almost imperceptibly at first, a micro-expression, a slight tightening of the lips, a subtle blink that betrayed an immediate reflex. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He had seen this before, the instantaneous, involuntary reaction of a mind caught in a lie. Lucien's careful composure faltered, however briefly, at the suggestion that the swan might see the truth. Poirot allowed the moment to linger, silent, observing the interplay of subtle fear and instinctive defense. "Ah," he murmured softly, more to himself than anyone else, "the little grey cells, yes. They betray the mind even when the tongue is silent." Then, in a gentle voice, he continued, "You see, mon cher Lucien, sometimes the most innocent appearance masks a tension that cannot be feigned. One imagines that the act has been perfect, yet the mind is unrelenting in its need for consistency, for concealment, a slip, a twitch, a hesitation, and the truth almost reveals its elf." Lucien shifted uneasily, his gaze dropping to the floor. I do not understand what you mean," he stammered, but his earlier composure had been fractured, replaced by an instinctive anxiety that Poirot had anticipated. The detective leaned forward, a small knowing smile playing on his lips. "Oh, you understand perfectly, mon ami. The swan is not the messenger, it is merely the mirror. And mirrors, as you know, never lie. Madame Berthier glanced at Lucien with concern, and even the doctor seemed to sense the subtle shift in tension. Poirot, however, was entirely calm, his mind alight with the revelation that the conventional evidence, letters, statements, and obvious clues, was secondary to the psychological signatures left behind in human behavior. He had observed the crack in Lucien's mask, a fleeting moment that revealed more than any letter or testimony could. By the time Poirot concluded the exercise, the subtle dynamics in the room had shifted decisively. Lucien's nervousness was no longer merely a response to accusation. It was an instinctive reaction to the suggestion that the truth itself could confront him, a sign that his own mind was not entirely aligned with the story he had been compelled to tell. Poirot's unorthodox method had done more than elicit information. It had revealed the tension beneath the surface, a tension he knew would guide him to the heart of the deception. Standing in the quiet study, Poirot allowed a satisfied nod. The swan, the exercise, the reactions, it all converged into a single insight. The crime had been staged. The false victory had misled the authorities. But human instinct, unguarded for a fraction of a second, was the ultimate clue. And now, with the smallest of cracks exposed in Lucien's demeanor, Poirot could begin to trace the true hand that had orchestrated this elaborate and brutal secret. The next morning, Poirot returned to the manor with a renewed sense of purpose, convinced that the psychological insight he had gained the day before would guide him closer to the truth. He was met, however, by a scene that immediately set his nerves on edge. Madame Berthier, her face pale and anxious, rushed to meet him at the door. "Monsieur Poirot, it's gone," she whispered, clutching the edges of her apron. "The ledger, the old ledger, with Monsieur Laval's notes and letters, it is missing." Poirot's brow furrowed, and he followed her inside to the study. The leather-bound book that had illuminated the hidden connections of the past, that had revealed subtle ties between Lucien's family, the housekeeper's kin and other villagers, had indeed vanished from its drawer. The space was neat, undisturbed in every other respect, yet the absence of the ledger was glaring. "Voilà," Poirot murmured under his breath, his sharp eyes scanning for signs of forced entry or tampering. The lock was intact, the drawer showed no scratches or marks, nothing suggesting that brute force had been used. Whoever had taken the ledger had done so with remarkable subtlety. Gendarme Leclerc arrived shortly after, summoned by the commotion, and immediately assumed the simplest explanation: theft for financial gain. "Perhaps someone thought it contained money, or papers of value, monsieur," he said, looking around nervously. Poirot, however, shook his head. "Non, mon ami. This is not about money. This is about knowledge, about control. Someone is attempting to obscure the past, to erase the trail that leads to the true author of this crime." The detective examined the surrounding area with meticulous care. The desk, the small cabinet, the fireplace, every possible hiding place or point of access had been inspected, yet there were no signs of disturbance. Even the swan remained undisturbed, a silent witness to the invisible hand that had removed the ledger. Poirot's mind worked quickly, considering who among those present, or who with access to the manor, would have the knowledge and audacity to seize such a vital piece of evidence. It could only be someone aware of its significance, someone who had the foresight to act before the investigation progressed further. He called Madame Berthier and Lucien into the room, observing their reactions closely. Both were startled, their eyes widening at the disappearance, yet Poirot noted the subtle differences in their responses. Madame Berthier's concern seemed genuine, her hands shaking as she gestured helplessly, while Lucien's composure cracked for a fleeting moment, a brief flicker of tension around his eyes. He did not speak, but his body betrayed a quiet awareness, as if he had expected such an occurrence. Poirot turned to Leclerc. "We must be vigilant. Whoever has taken the ledger understands its value. They are clever, yes, and cautious, but even the cleverest cannot resist leaving traces if one knows where to look. We will find it, or find evidence of its fate." Hours passed in methodical search, each corner of the manor re-examined with obsessive precision. Poirot observed the dust patterns on the floor, the subtle shift of objects, and the faint disturbances in the hearth's ashes. Nothing yielded the ledger, yet each minute heightened the sense of urgency. The case, already complex, had been thrown into further chaos. Whoever sought to obstruct the investigation had escalated the stakes, and with each passing hour, trust became more fragile. Poirot's gaze rested on Lucien once more, subtlety sharpening in his mind. "It is not merely removal," he murmured to himself. "It is an act of strategy, designed to mislead, to pressure, to provoke anxiety and doubt. The culprit is watching, waiting to see how we respond. And yet, such acts leave psychological traces if one knows where to look." The detective realized that the theft of the ledger, far from halting the investigation, had illuminated the presence of an active mind working against them, an intelligent adversary who understood both the value of the evidence and the mechanics of human perception. The crime was no longer a puzzle of static facts. It had become a dynamic contest, a battle of wits between the criminal and the one who could observe motives with unerring precision. By the late afternoon, Poirot stood once more in the study, the quiet weight of the missing ledger pressing on him. He understood that this setback was deliberate, a test of patience, an attempt to derail the search for truth. But he also knew that every calculated act of concealment, every subtle attempt to manipulate perception, left its mark. And it was in these shadows, in the echoes of what had been taken and what remained, that Poirot would find the next clue, one that would bring the real criminal out of hiding, whether they were ready or not. The night fell over St. Clair with an unsettling stillness, the manor's stone walls seeming to hold their breath. Poirot, though weary from the day's meticulous scrutiny, could not rest. The disappearance of the ledger had unsettled him more than he would admit, and he resolved to remain in the manor until he had extracted every possible insight from its silent rooms. Just after midnight, a sudden, sharp commotion tore through the quiet, a frantic knocking at the study door, followed by Madame Berthier's panicked voice. Monsieur Poirot is terrible, terrible," she cried, struggling to catch her breath. Poirot rose instantly, his keen senses alert. "Calmez-vous, madame. What has happened?" he asked, his voice calm but urgent. She could barely speak, finally managing to gasp. Lucien is gone. The room, his bed, empty. It is as if he vanished into thin air." Poirot's mind raced, the threads of his investigation snapping into sharp focus. The young gardener's disappearance was no accident. Someone with knowledge of the manor, of its routines, and of the investigation itself had acted under cover of darkness, removing Lucien before anyone could intervene. It was an audacious, almost theatrical move, a deliberate demonstration of control over the situation. He moved swiftly, his eyes scanning every corner of the house with renewed intensity. The window in Lucien's room was locked, undisturbed, as it had been the previous night. The door showed no signs of forced entry, and yet, as he bent to examine the floor, Poirot noticed a faint scuff, almost imperceptible in the moonlight, near the baseboard. A clue, tiny and easily overlooked, hinted at the direction of Lucien's removal, a careful lift or guiding hand, perhaps, rather than a struggle. Poirot summoned Gendarme Leclerc immediately. "We must act without delay," he said, his voice sharp, commanding. "The disappearance of Lucien indicates the culprit's audacity. They are aware of our scrutiny and are prepared to escalate their actions. We cannot allow another crime, perhaps far more grievous, to occur." Leclerc, flustered but obedient, gathered a small contingent of villagers to aid in a search of the surrounding grounds, lanterns flickering in the cold night air. Poirot, however, focused not on the visible search, but on the subtle indicators left behind. He revisited the swan on the desk, turning it gently in his hands, considering its symbolism once more. He recalled the reactions the previous day, Lucien's fleeting hesitation, the calculated responses of the housekeeper and the doctor, the stolen ledger, and the way each had interacted with him. Patterns emerged in his mind, forming a lattice of behavior, psychology, and opportunity. The disappearance was a message as much as it was an act, a challenge, a demonstration that the criminal remained several steps ahead. Poirot's sharp gaze fell on the fireplace, its hearth recently disturbed during the search for the ledger. There, faint smudges of ash and a subtle displacement of soot suggested movement that had not been documented previously. He crouched, examining the pattern of disturbance, and noted that it led not out the main door, but toward a narrow, little-used corridor leading to the servants' wing. Ah, Un pas de plus, he murmured. The villain had intimate knowledge of the manor's layout, the routines of its occupants, and the ability to manipulate these elements with precise timing. As the search continued in the moonlit gardens, Poirot pieced together the implications. The disappearance of Lucien was not merely an act of silencing, it was designed to destabilize the investigation, to pressure witnesses, and to create panic. Whoever had orchestrated this understood human nature with precision and had anticipated every reaction. It was a criminal operating not merely with cunning, but with a strategic vision, and now the stakes had been raised to a critical level. Poirot stood in the study, silent for a long moment, feeling the tension coiling like a spring. The manor, so long a place of calm, was now a theatre of threats and hidden movements. The villain was watching, waiting, and capable of further violence if provoked. Yet Poirot's determination did not waver. The challenge had become urgent. He would not only solve Monsieur Laval's murder, but now had to prevent another tragedy. With his mind alive with deduction and foresight, he resolved to anticipate the next move, to trace the unseen hand manipulating events, and to bring the shadowed architect of St. Clair's chaos into the light before another life could be claimed by the dim glow of a lantern in the manor's stud. Poirot sat alone, reviewing every observation, every testimony, every subtle indication he had recorded over the past days. The chaos of Lucien's disappearance, the stolen ledger, the false victory with the letter, all these events pressed upon him, yet amidst the turbulence a pattern began to crystallize in his mind. He revisited small, almost trivial details that others had overlooked. The smudge of ink on the origami swan, Lucien's fleeting micro-expressions, Madame Berthier's nervous gestures, and even the faint, lingering scent of cigar smoke in the study. He thought back to the conversation the previous morning when he had asked the witnesses to describe the swan, the psychological test that had revealed the first cracks in composure. It was in Lucien's involuntary reaction that Poirot had seen a key truth. The young gardener was not the mastermind. The real architect of the chaos had anticipated reactions, exploited human psychology, and manipulated events with careful timing. But until now, the reason behind these manipulations had remained just beyond reach. Poirot rose and walked slowly toward the shelves, scanning the rows of books and papers that lined the walls. A single volume, slightly out of alignment, caught his attention. Its spine bore a faint scuff, barely perceptible, as though someone had handled it recently. He pulled it down and opened the pages to find old letters and notes, correspondence between Monsieur Laval and various villagers spanning decades. He paused at a line written in fine, deliberate script, a seemingly innocent remark regarding a birthday dinner, noting who had arrived, who had left early, and who had appeared distracted. A trivial observation at the time, yet now it resonated with deeper meaning. The meticulous recording of behavior, of minor habits, was not idle. It was the key to understanding the mind of the person who accompanied. You'd orchestrate such precise manipulation. Poirot's eyes travelled to the desk once more, resting on the swan. The folds, the placement, the slight smudge of ink, all had seemed like artistic touches, but now they aligned perfectly with the pattern emerging in his mind. The swan was not merely a message, it was a signature, a method of communicating subtle misdirection. The careful, deliberate precision suggested that the criminal relied on routine and observation, exploiting habits and expectations to stage events that seemed natural, even coincidental, while masking intentionality. He recalled Madame Berthier's earlier comments about footsteps and shadows she had noticed but dismissed at the time. Now they fit into the larger picture, someone moving quietly through the manor, deliberately choosing when and how to be seen or unseen, timing each act to create confusion and misdirect attention. The minor inconsistencies, the slight scuff in Lucien's room, the delicate disarray in the hearth, the carefully concealed ledger, all became part of a coherent sequence, a choreography designed to manipulate perception. Poirot's mind raced as he connected this insight to the village's historical context, the old disputes, the hidden resentments chronicled in the ledger, the familial connections. These were not just background noise, they were instruments of influence, shaping reactions and conditioning behavior over decades. The criminal had studied the past and the present simultaneously. using the intimate knowledge of St. Clair's social rhythms to engineer both deception and panic. A smile crept across Poirot's face, small but certain. The pattern had been in plain sight all along. Every minute detail, every hesitation, every carefully placed object, all were deliberate, part of a larger hidden logic. The origami swan, Lucien's reactions, the stolen ledger, they were not random occurrences, but elements in a meticulously constructed design. Poirot now understood that the key to unraveling the case lay not in chasing false leads or reacting to panic, but in interpreting the intentions behind the smallest of actions, in reading the invisible lines that connected motive, opportunity, and personality. He leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a moment of satisfaction. The criminal's genius, subtle and patient, had created layers of misdirection, yet the very precision that made the plan formidable also exposed its weakness. The minor anomalies, once dismissed, now illuminated the path forward. The pattern had emerged, and with it the solution drew nearer, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the keen eye that could perceive order in the chaos, and patience to follow its threads to the final revelation. Poirot spent the morning in quiet contemplation, revisiting the minutiae that had begun to reveal the criminal's methods. He examined the study once more, walking slowly from desk to window, noting the faint trails in the dust, the subtle smudge of ink on the swan, and the imperceptible indentation in the carpet where someone had knelt. Each tiny anomaly had once seemed trivial, yet now they coalesced into a map of intent, each step, each gesture, deliberate and laden with meaning. He summoned Madame Berthier and the doctor once again, instructing them to recount minor details they had thought irrelevant, conversations, offhand remarks, gestures they had witnessed over the past weeks. As they spoke, Poirot listened not only to the content of their words, but to the rhythm, the inflection, the subtleties of hesitation. Lucien's disappearance, the stolen ledger, and the carefully staged misdirections all pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of human psychology, someone capable of anticipating how others would react under pressure. And then, licked, a small, almost insignificant remark Madame Berthier had made days before, about how Monsieur Laval had always insisted that certain villagers were like family to him, suddenly illuminated the entire case. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he considered the implications. The crime was not a matter of financial gain, nor mere revenge, nor petty jealousy. It was far more intricate, far more personal. The criminal had acted not out of greed or rivalry, but from a profound, almost pathological need for control over the lives around them, a compulsion to orchestrate events, to shape perception and dictate outcomes with absolute precision. He called Lucien's father, a man long estranged from the village yet quietly observing the developments from a distance, to the study. Poirot's questions were careful, probing, revealing yet non-threatening. Slowly, piece by piece, a pattern of obsessive attachment and deep-seated fear emerged. The perpetrator had seen the deaths and disappearances not as consequences, but as instruments, necessary elements in an elaborate psychological tableau designed to enforce order in their own mind. Each act of misdirection, each planted clue, each manipulated witness was a reflection of an inner compulsion, a need to confirm that their perception of reality remained unchallenged. Poirot's sharp gaze fell once again on the swan. The meticulous folds, the ink smudge, the deliberate placement, all were expressions of the criminal's psyche, a coded confession visible only to a keen observer. This was a mind fascinated not by wealth or status, but by the interplay of control and chaos, by the capacity to manipulate the environment and the people within it, to satisfy an internal obsession. Even the ledger's theft, the disappearance of Lucien, and the false accusation were not miscalculations, they were deliberate tests of influence executed to gauge an ENF. Or's dominance over circumstance and perception. The revelation shocked even Poirot in its audacity. The crime, horrific as it was, had been driven not by conventional motives, but by a deep psychological need, the desire to impose order through manipulation, to craft a narrative in which every detail, every human reaction, confirmed the criminal's intellectual and emotional authority. It was a motive hidden in plain sight, camouflaged beneath layers of routine, tradition, and village history, yet undeniably present in the meticulous choreography of each event. Poirot finally addressed the assembled witnesses, his voice calm but charged with authority. "Mes amis," he said, "the truth is often more extraordinary than fiction. We have sought the crime in money, in rivalry, in resentment, yet the motive has been something far more subtle and far more compelling. It is the psychology of the mind, the obsession with control that has driven these actions, and it is by understanding the mind of the criminal, by tracing the careful design behind each seemingly trivial detail, that we shall bring this person to justice." For a moment, silence filled the study, heavy with realization. Madame Berthier's eyes widened, the doctor's hand trembled slightly, and even the distant echoes of St. Clair seemed to pause in recognition. Poirot, serene and unyielding, knew that the final steps of the investigation would demand a confrontation not only with evidence, but with the very essence of a mind capable of such calculated manipulation. The villain's motive, now exposed in all its shocking complexity, transformed the investigation. The case was no longer a search for opportunity or circumstance, but a pursuit of understanding, a pursuit that would lead directly to the one who had orchestrated St. Clair's brutal secret with such relentless precision. Poirot spent the hours before night fell, all arranging the final steps of his plan with meticulous care. The manor, silent and watchful, seemed to breathe with anticipation, each room a stage set for the inevitable revelation. He had pieced together the subtle signals, the minor inconsistencies, the psychological patterns that marked the mind of the criminal. Now, he intended to draw the culprit out, using their own obsession with control and precision against them. He invited the remaining witnesses, Madame Berthier and the doctor, into the study, requesting that they remain close but quiet, and he ensured that Gendarme Leclerc waited discreetly outside. Poirot himself positioned strategically near the fireplace, his eyes moving over every shadow, every line of sight, every subtle detail that could conceal a hidden hand. On the desk lay the origami swan, a symbol of the intricate manipulations that had marked the investigation. It was, in essence, a lure, an object that had already elicited reactions, one that the criminal could not ignore. As the hour approached, Poirot's patience was rewarded. The study door opened with the faintest of creaks, and a figure slipped inside, glancing nervously around. It was the village doctor. At first, his movements were measured, calculated to appear casual, yet Poirot's sharp eyes detected the almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders, the subtle twitch in his hand as it hovered near the swan. The detective spoke softly, as if merely musing aloud. "Ah, I see you have come to inspect the swan once again. Fascinating, is it not? How such a simple object can reveal truths if one only observes carefully." The doctor froze, his composure cracking for a split second, and Poirot's gaze never wavered. He allowed the moment to stretch, giving the criminal space to respond, while silently noting every micro-expression. "Monsieur," Poirot continued, leaning slightly forward, "you, have a mind most extraordinary, capable of anticipating reaction, controlling outcome, orchestrating events with subtle precision. Yet even the most careful planning leaves traces. Small signs that betray the hand behind the act." The doctor's eyes flicked nervously to the window, then to the swan, and finally down to the desk. His breathing became shallow, his previously calm demeanor dissolving into a fragile veneer. Poirot, serene and unshaken, continued, "It is not for money, not for revenge, not for power. The crime has been driven by something more profound, a desire to shape, to control, to manipulate, to confirm that all occurs according to one's design. Such a motive is rare, yet visible in the smallest details, and details, mon ami, are the currency of truth." The doctor swallowed hard, a bead of sweat glistening at his temple. I did what had to be done," he stammered, voice faltering. "I could not allow chaos, mistakes, disorder. He had to be controlled. I only wanted to see that nothing spiraled out of place." His confession emerged hesitantly, each word revealing a mind driven by compulsion, by the need to orchestrate events, to enforce a sense of order upon a world he perceived as fragile and unpredictable. Poirot's expression softened slightly, not in sympathy, but in acknowledgement of understanding. "Yes, mon ami, you sought order, yet in doing so, you created devastation. It is remarkable how a mind so meticulous can still be betrayed by instinct, by the compulsion to control, and by the tiniest of overlooked details. And it is these very details that have revealed you to us." The doctor's shoulders slumped as he sank into a chair, the weight of inevitability pressing down. There was no escape. No last, desperate move could now obscure the evidence meticulously collected, the observations of human behavior, or the logical thread woven by Poirot. Unerring deduction. The stolen ledger, the disappearance of Lucien, the false accusations, all were now understood as pieces in the pattern, culminating in this moment of revelation. Poirot allowed the silence to deepen, each breath and subtle shift in the room emphasizing the gravity of the moment. Outside, Gendarme Leclerc moved to step in, but Poirot raised a calm hand. "No need for haste. The truth has been spoken, the mind behind these acts has been exposed. Justice, mon ami, need only follow naturally from clarity." The doctor nodded, finally relinquishing his carefully maintained facade. Poirot, satisfied that every piece of the intricate puzzle had been revealed, returned to his chair, his hands folded neatly. The tension in the room dissipated slowly, replaced by a profound sense of resolution. The villain had been confronted, the psychological motive laid bare, and the carefully orchestrated chaos reduced to comprehensible sequence. St. Clair, though scarred by events, could now breathe again, and Poirot, composed and vigilant, allowed himself the quiet satisfaction of a case finally and impeccably solved. The manor had grown quiet, almost serene, with the doctor now subdued, seated by the desk and awaiting the inevitable intervention of the authorities. Poirot, however, remained alert, his keen eyes scanning the study one last time. Though the confession seemed complete, an instinctive sense of incompleteness tugged at him, a subtle dissonance that even the elaborate revelations of the past hours could not entirely resolve. He had learned long ago that in a case of human deception, the final truth often lies in the unspoken, the overlooked, the subtle clue that appears innocuous at first glance. Poirot's gaze fell once more upon the origami swan, its folds immaculate, its ink smudge deliberate. Something about it, he realized, had always struck him as too, perfect, too carefully staged. His mind retraced every step, the stolen ledger, Lucien's disappearance, the false letter, the doctor's manipulations. All pointed toward the doctor as the principal agent of chaos. Yet the question lingered. Someone had orchestrated the placement of these elements with such precision that only intimate knowledge of the manor, of the villagers, and of Monsieur Laval's routines could account for it. He rose and walked to the desk, lifting the swan carefully. Then he noticed it. A faint fingerprint, almost imperceptible, on the corner of the paper where the ink smudge rested. It was not the doctor's fingerprint, nor Lucien's, nor Madame Berthier's. Poirot's little grey cells stirred. "Ah, mon Dieu! But, of course," he whispered under his breath, a subtle smile forming. The doctor had acted under compulsion. Yes, but someone else had planned the orchestration. Someone had set the stage, designed the misdirection, and guided the actions that led to the doctor's confession. Poirot turned swiftly to Madame Berthier. "Tell me, madame, did anyone visit the manor recently, someone you might have thought innocuous, someone who asked questions under the guise of casual conversation?" Her eyes widened slightly. "Well, there was Monsieur Dufresne, the new librarian from the neighboring village. He asked after the ledger, mentioned curiosities about the old letters, but I thought nothing of it. The pieces began to fall into place. Monsieur Dufresne, the mild-mannered librarian, had cultivated a facade of scholarly interest, observing the manor, the villagers, and even the doctor, all under the guise of innocuous curiosity. He had noted tendencies, habits, and vulnerabilities, then subtly nudged events into motion, exploiting the doctor's compulsive need for control. The doctor had not been the mastermind. He had been a willing instrument, carefully manipulated by a more calculating intelligence. Poirot summoned Leclerc at once. "Gendarme, we must find Monsieur Dufresne." He has played the role of puppeteer, while allowing another to take the blame, or rather, to act under influence. The fingerprints on the swan, the orchestration of events, the subtle misdirection, all point to him. And if we act swiftly, we can prevent further consequences. The search was immediate, and as predicted, Monsieur Dufresne was discovered near the outskirts of the village, attempting to retrieve documents he had planted to further obscure his involvement. Confronted with Poirot's calm but penetrating gaze, the librarian's composure faltered. The realization that his plan had been anticipated, and that every subtle action had been observed and interpreted, struck him with sudden force. It was supposed to be perfect," he murmured, a tremor in his voice. "I did not intend for any harm." Poirot allowed him a moment, observing the micro-expressions, the involuntary signs of guilt. "Perfect, mon ami, perhaps," he said gently, "but perfection, when tested by observation and reason, often reveals the smallest imperfection, and it is the smallest imperfection that exposes the grandest design." With Monsieur Dufresne apprehended, the layers of the St. Clair mystery finally fell away. The doctor had acted under compulsive manipulation, the initial misdirections had been carefully staged, and the true mastermind, hidden behind a veneer of innocent curiosity, had orchestrated events from the shadows. Poirot allowed himself a moment to reflect, the weight of the case settling around him. The labyrinth of human motives, compulsions, and subtle deceptions had tested his skill to the utmost, yet the final revelation, the last-minute twist, had proven both the danger of assumption and the brilliance of careful observation. As the village exhaled, freed from the tension that had gripped it for weeks, Poirot stood in the study, serene yet vigilant. The brutal secret of St. Clair had been fully unveiled, each layer of deception exposed, yet the case remained a testament to the complexity of human psychology, the patience required to discern truth, and the unerring power of observation to reveal what was hidden even in plain sight. By the dim light of the study, Poirot allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction as the pieces of St. Clair's labyrinthine mystery finally fell into place. Monsieur Dufresne, the librarian, was securely in custody, his carefully constructed mask of innocence shattered by the incontrovertible evidence, the fingerprints on the origami swan, the patterns of misdirection, and the subtle nudges that had manipulated the doctor into committing acts he might otherwise have resisted. The truth, at last, had emerged from the shadows, yet Poirot felt the familiar chill of unease that always accompanies the conclusion of a case involving human obsession and deceit. He gathered the villagers, the doctor, Madame Berthier, and Lucien, who had returned shaken but unharmed, in the manor's study. Poirot spoke slowly, his voice deliberate, as though mayor, shoring the weight of each revelation. "Mes amis," he began, "the events of recent weeks have seemed chaotic, even inexplicable, yet every action, every hesitation, every seemingly trivial occurrence has followed a pattern, one that, in the end, points unerringly to the architect of this mischief." He traced the sequence of events, articulating with precision what had been missed by all but his acute observation. The subtle anxiety in Lucien's micro-expressions, the compulsive actions of the doctor, and the deliberate placement of the swan. "Monsieur Dufresne," Poirot continued, "has been the orchestrator. He observed the manor, studied its inhabitants, and exploited human tendencies with extraordinary skill. The ledger's theft, Lucien's disappearance, the false leads, they were all calculated measures designed to distract and manipulate. Yet even the most intricate plan leaves traces for those who know where to look." The villagers murmured among themselves, astonished at the depth of the deception. Lucien's father shook his head in disbelief, the doctor bowed his head in reluctant acknowledgment, and Madame Berthier's hands trembled as she processed the web of manipulation that had enveloped them all. Poirot allowed the silence to settle before continuing, drawing attention to the subtle evidence that had exposed the villain. "Observe, for example, the origami swan," he said, holding it gently for all to see. "It was not mere decoration. Note the ink smudge in the corner, faint though it is. It was placed deliberately, yet it bore the fingerprint of Monsieur Dufresne. The swan, a symbol of observation and misdirection, became the instrument of detection itself. And consider the small scuff in Lucien's room, overlooked in haste, yet it indicated the direction and method of his removal. Each detail, innocuous to the careless eye, was a signature of intent, signatures visi. Bleu only to one who observes without presumption. Poirot paused, allowing the weight of his explanation to settle. "It is the smallest things that betray the grandest designs," he said, his voice both gentle and unwavering. "The human mind, when driven by obsession or compulsion, leaves itself open in ways that mere force cannot conceal. And it is by observing these openings that justice, true justice, can be delivered." Yet as the authorities escorted Monsieur Dufresne from the manor, Poirot remained thoughtful, his gaze lingering on the faint traces of disruption he had noted throughout the investigation. Though the mastermind was apprehended, he could not ignore the subtle imperfections, the unspoken hesitations in those who had acted under influence, and the potential for unseen consequences. The manor, the village, and the people who had lived so quietly within it had been irrevocably altered by the chain of events set in motion by a single calculating mind. Lucien approached Poirot quietly, his voice low. "Monsieur Poirot, do you think it is truly over?" The detective's eyes, sharp and reflective, met the young man's. "Perhaps, mon ami. Yet in cases such as these, the conclusion is never absolute. Human nature is unpredictable, and obsession can linger long after the actors are removed. What is certain, however, is that observation, patience, and the unrelenting pursuit of truth have exposed what was hidden. Justice, in its purest sense, has been served, though the echoes of mischief may yet linger." As night fully embraced the village, Poirot lingered in the study alone for a moment, his mind replaying each observation, each subtle clue, and each revelation. The case was closed in terms of law, yet the psychological and emotional traces of the crime remained in St. Clair, subtle reminders that human cunning could both conceal and reveal in equal measure. Poirot, haute, serene but vigilant, allowed himself a quiet nod. Once again, the little grey cells had prevailed, proving that careful observation and the study of human nature are the ultimate instruments in unmasking deception, ensuring that even in the face of extraordinary manipulation, truth and justice remains within reach. The village of St. Clair settled into an uneasy calm in the days that followed. Monsieur Dufresne had been taken into custody, the doctor's compulsive actions were understood, and the ledger, once stolen, now recovered, lay safely on the study desk. Lucien and Madame Berthier began the slow process of returning to routine, their lives slightly reshaped by the tension and deception that had passed through the manor like a storm. Poirot, however, did not rush to depart. He lingered, as always, attentive to the smallest details, convinced that even a case seemingly resolved could hide a whisper of unanswered questions. Walking through the corridors of the manor one last time, he allowed his eyes to drift over the familiar furnishings, the worn floorboards, the small scuffs, and the dust patterns that still hinted at movement unseen. The swan remained perched on the desk, its folds and slight ink smudge now an emblem of the intricate web of observation, psychology, and human folly that had ensnared St. Clair. Yet Poirot noticed a subtle irregularity he had not considered before, a tiny envelope tucked beneath the drawer, almost imperceptible, its edges worn from handling. He bent to retrieve it, careful not to disturb the surrounding papers, and held it delicately in his hand. The envelope was unmarked, save for a single cryptic symbol, a swirl almost like a fingerprint in ink, unfamiliar and yet deliberate. Poirot's sharp mind immediately recognized that it did not belong to any of the known actors in the case. He opened it carefully, revealing a slip of paper upon which a few words had been inscribed in rapid, precise handwriting. "The game is never finished. Watch carefully." A chill passed over him, not of fear, but of intrigue. Even now, when the criminal had been apprehended and the immediate danger had passed, the threads of mystery seemed to extend beyond the visible boundaries of the case. Someone, somewhere, had anticipated the investigation, had left a subtle message, a challenge, perhaps, to those with eyes capable of perceiving it. Poirot's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. This was the thrill he always sought, the awareness that human cunning could never be entirely contained, that the dance between observation and deception was eternal. He folded the slip carefully, placing it in his coat pocket, and stepped toward the manor door. Lucien waved quietly from the threshold. The tension in his posture softened but not entirely gone. Madame Berthier watched from the window, the flicker of gratitude in her eyes mingling with a shadow of uncertainty. Poirot nodded, acknowledging both the relief and the lingering unease that would remain, as it always did, after the resolution of a particularly intricate mystery. As he walked down the lane, the cold evening air brushing against his face, Poirot reflected on the journey he had undertaken in St. Clair. Every observation, every subtle gesture, every inconspicuous detail had been a piece of a vast, complex puzzle. Yet the cryptic note, tucked away and unnoticed by all others, reminded him that the world of mystery was never static. Human motives, hidden truths, and concealed designs continued to operate just beyond perception, waiting for the keen eye, the patient observer, the detective willing to follow the faintest trace. The lanterns of the village flickered in the distance, casting long shadows that danced over the cobblestones, as if to remind him that Eve. Wry's solution is but a prelude to the next question. Poirot's steps were measured, his posture elegant, his mind alive with possibilities. Even as he left St. Clair behind, he knew that the threads of deception, the traces of human cunning, would continue to ripple through the village, subtle yet persistent, awaiting discovery. He allowed himself one last glance over the shoulder at the manor, its windows dark, its secrets laid bare yet not entirely extinguished. Mon Dieu, he murmured softly, the game is never finished. And with that he turned, walking toward the horizon, the lantern light fading behind him, carrying with him the certainty that wherever deception lurked, the little grey cells would follow, patient, observant, and ready for the next challenge. In St. Clair, life would resume its quiet rhythm, but the air remained tinged with the faintest hint of unease, a reminder that every solved mystery leaves whispers of the unknown, every conclusion the seed of a new investigation. And for Hercule Poirot, that was a certainty as invigorating as it was endless.